Good morning, everyone. We're going to just give a couple more minutes, 4 or 5 more minutes, if you have to run to the bathroom or you would like to grab a drink of water, and then we will get started. Thank you so much for coming.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. If you could take a seat, I'll give you a few minutes for everyone to settle. It's wonderful to see so many faces here today. I'm Keena Skeffington. I'm chair of the board of directors of Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, or HMML, as we all like to refer to it. As you know, HMML is celebrating 60 years of operation with a mission that has stayed substantially the same for 6 decades. Quite a feat. And that mission is to preserve and share the world's handwritten past to inspire a deeper understanding of our present and future. I'm excited that we're all gathered here today to commemorate the past 60 years and look to the future as HMML continues to work around the world, helping to save written cultural heritage, one photograph at a time. Once again, thank you all for being here today. And now I'm going to turn the microphone over to one of our own catalogers, Dr. Ani Shahinian, and she'll tell you a little bit more about HMML.
Hello and welcome. I am Ani Shahinian, the Armenian cataloger at Hill Museum Manuscript Library. For thousands of years and into the very present day, people have recorded stories, beliefs, discoveries, histories, all handwritten books known as manuscripts. You had the chance to see a few just a minute ago as you were nicely conversing and mingling. These manuscripts are more than just historical objects. They're more than artifacts. They are human voices. It's their stories, it's their beliefs that carries across many centuries, offering insight into how people understood their world then and how we can actually enter into their world through these treasured artifacts. They contain clues to what our predecessors believed was worth preserving for future generations. It raises even the question for me as I catalog and look at these, what am I preserving today for the 1,000 years? And they carry past and present relationships of how they were handled, how they were used, how they were kept in homes, carried into churches, into mosques, into temples, consulted in moments of ritual, reflection, scholarship. Every manuscript is unique. Every manuscript tells us a story. To protect these voices from being lost, HMML partners with libraries, communities across the world to digitally photograph manuscripts, manuscript collections and the repositories, and to share these images online. I had the pleasure of showing some of this to you with my computer today. Special priority is given to manuscripts located in regions that are threatened by war, genocides, political instability, environmental hazards, and of course, all types of dangers that face these precious artifacts. HMML provides local teams with all the training and the tools, equipment, technical support, and funding to do this work of preservation. It is a work that cannot be done without these communities. It is taken together the effort of what HMML provides for these communities to preserve these collections. Every manuscript in the collection is photographed, every single one, even the blank pages, because every manuscript that might seem ordinary today to me may actually become an invaluable insight for the future generations. Copies of the digital images remain with the local repository, while another copy of it is preserved by Himmel to ensure long-term access and protection. At Himmel, experts identify, organize, and preserve these manuscripts in images, making them freely available to the public. So you create an account and you have access to thousands of beautiful manuscripts. Researchers visit Himmel both in Minnesota, here in Collegeville, and virtually through Himmel's reading rooms, an online library that provides free access to millions of manuscript images. Today, we are all here together celebrating the 60 years of this phenomenal work. Thank you for being with us. In that spirit, please help me welcome Dr. Nina Archibald, a longtime friend of Himmel. Nina. Oh, thank you.
Good morning. Now that's the kind of introduction I like, my name. That'll work. Some of you may recognize me as the longtime director of Minnesota Historical Society. And you may also know that I served as Minnesota's State Historic Preservation Officer. In these roles, I was involved in preserving both written and unwritten history, from manuscripts to historic and archaeological sites. The oldest known in Minnesota, and I think most people in Minnesota don't know this. We think about our history as being relatively short when people, Euro-Americans came. No, it's much longer. The oldest known site in Minnesota dates from about 10,000 years ago, we think. And some of these sites actually include written heritage. Now, to my knowledge, Himmel has not collected any of this. I hope not. We're going to leave it right in situ. Perhaps the best known example are the petroglyphs on the Jeffers site in southwestern Minnesota near Windham. So you can visit there and actually see these amazing images left on quartzite rock by ancient people. But obviously the written heritage you're going to hear about today is much different. And our speaker is Dr. Columba Stewart, Executive Director of Himmel, located on the campus of St. John's University in Collegeville. We call it HMML, we call it Himmel, call it what you will. It's a great place. You would immediately recognize the work of Himmel as a scholarly pursuit. I certainly did when I became a member of the board in 2004. What you may not know is that Himmel is not your average scholarly library. You heard this. It's a place that preserves written heritage by preserving images online. I think of Himmel as, and Columba in particular, he's never heard of himself, I think, referred to in this way, as a storm chaser. When you think about a storm chaser, you think about one of the scouts that gets in a car and chases tornadoes, something you could never sign me up to do. But Columba chases a different kind of storm. He is in pursuit of photographing written heritage that is threatened by either human or natural causes, as we heard, sometimes war or some act of nature. The recent situation in Mali comes to mind, where a coalition of armed groups threatened the cultural heritage of Timbuktu, got moved in canoes, I understand, to Bamako, where it has been preserved, but this situation is still not stable. In the same vein, consider the situations in Ukraine, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Ethiopia, Turkey, and Pakistan, all places where Himmel has worked. And there are the acts of nature. I remember this visiting India a number of years ago with Columba and with Himmel. There we saw that palm leaves, on which there is written material history, is being threatened, and paper being destroyed by silverfish who eat their way. Anybody who's had silverfish in their house knows how destructive they can be. So whether it's a war or silverfish, Himmel's there protecting the unique materials. Since 2003, the chase has been brilliantly led by Dr. Columba Stewart, a native of Texas. Spent most of his adult life as a monk associated with St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. Today, he's an independent scholar holding the position of theologian in residence at St. Mark's Episcopal Cathedral in Minneapolis, just a hop, skip, and a jump from here. But he continues his work as executive director of our Himmel. Columba has degrees from Harvard, Yale, and Oxford University. He's published through Oxford University Press. In 2019, Columba gave the Jefferson Lecture for the National Endowment for the Humanities. This lecture, being selected to give that lecture, is the highest honor for distinguished intellectual achievement in the humanities. It is a very, very, very big deal. I read the remarks that Columba made on that occasion, and one thought sums up for me the essence of your work, Columba. He told the story of a medieval Benedictine abbot known as Peter the Venerable. According to Columba, this is a quote from Columba, Peter embraced the humanistic principle that to understand people of another culture with different beliefs, we must listen to them in their own voice, learning their language, reading and understanding their text. Columba has shown us that the work of Himmel is to read and to listen and to share, creating understanding by using the most modern technology available today. What could be more important in today's troubled world than to find a way to understand another culture? Friends, please welcome our own Columba the Venerable.
Good morning, everybody. You've been given a little preview of some of what I'll be sharing. So we're back to the beginning of the slideshow here. And let me just get my other screen set up, and off we go. It's lovely to see so many people gathering on a beautiful Saturday morning where the call of nature might be urging you on to tend your garden or some other outdoor pursuit. But we're here for a wonderful celebration of 60 years. Now, as I look out at the crowd, I realize that after 6 decades, Himmel is starting to catch up with some of us in our years. But as those of us who've celebrated 60 years of life know, 60 is a milestone, but by no means an end point. It's a time to catch your breath, to be thankful for what's in the rearview mirror, and then to look ahead to what the next chapters of life will bring. And that's what we're doing today for Himmel. Looking back in gratitude, but not fixed on the past, but always looking toward the future. In one other important respect, Himmel's 60th is not like a 60th birthday party for one of us, because we can count on at least another 6 decades for Himmel, and probably another 6 beyond that, and beyond that, and beyond that. We are in it for the long haul, and that commitment is at the very heart of our mission. So I'm not going to give you a death march through each decade of Himmel's history. My original concept was 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. No, that's going to just be awful. You had the beautiful images on the screen earlier, which gave you a kind of retrospective view of aspects of our history. And I certainly will be looping back to significant moments and figures. But instead, I want to do a more holistic view of what Himmel is, and then to illustrate that with some of the stories from these 6 decades. And some of these are life stories. Some of these are recent news, which show that we continue to do today what we did from the very outset. So let's start. The fundamental question, our cataloger Ani has begun to suggest why manuscripts, what the answer to that question is. But this is fundamental, because when we try to explain what Himmel is to somebody who's never heard of us, they often don't even know what a manuscript is. But within about 3 sentences, they begin to realize that everything we know from our ancestors, their voices, as Ani said, a phrase I like to use too, the voices of our ancestors, came to us through a manuscript, occasionally an inscription. And of course, there's art and architecture and archaeological remains. Those are insights into culture, but they are not voices of people, because people speak languages. And some languages in the course of history have been written down. And it is those voices that we're able to encounter through the manuscripts. If you ever want to go down a fascinating rabbit hole, just do a search for extinct languages. And what's striking about that list of extinct languages is many of them were never written down. So it was the living people who preserved it until they were no more. Only a small fraction of the languages in human history ever developed a writing system. And even highly sophisticated cultures like the Inca Empire did not have writing. Fortunately, the language survived, but you may know that they had these things called quipus, which were knotted strings to record important information. Astonishing to us how magnificent it would have been if we could have known what was going on in their minds and hearts throughout key points in their history when the Spanish arrived, but there are no manuscripts except later accounts. So we deal with the languages and cultures which developed writing systems or borrowed a writing system, as is so often the case in the world where, for example, the Roman alphabet, the Latin alphabet can serve for other languages. Arabic script has been used for so many different languages. And in those manuscripts, in the writing on a page, a palm leaf, a piece of bark, whatever can support writing upon it, we hear their voices. So what did they write down? Well, when people say, what's in these manuscripts? My answer is simply to say, whatever they thought was worth writing down. In a time when the materials for writing were expensive, parchment, paper, papyrus, whatever they were using, very few people had the skill of writing, and even people who could read couldn't necessarily write, because back in the day, those were two distinct skill sets, because writing with a quill and ink and all the rest of it was a highly technical undertaking. So in other words, you didn't just jot down any random thought, although you often find in manuscripts of great literary value marginal notes, comments, little facts of what happened in recent history that people thought worth preserving and wanted to make sure that it was somewhere, even if it was just in a marginal note. Kind of the way that the tradition of the old family Bible, which became the kind of ark of important documents and events in the history of the family and so on. So one finds this in manuscripts as well. So as an example of a manuscript that preserves important information for a particular culture or place, I want to talk about this particular manuscript. So this is a church in Aleppo, Syria, and the fellow opening the vault is called Yohanna Ibrahim Mar Gregorios. He was the Metropolitan Archbishop for the Syriac Orthodox Church in Aleppo, and I'll be saying more about him a bit later. What he's opening the vault to get is the only surviving copy of the chronicle of a Syriac Orthodox patriarch called Michael the Great, Mikhail Rabo, who was an historian and world chronicler. In the ancient world, there was something known as a world chronicle, which would start with the creation of the world at whatever date a particular religious tradition decided the world was created and history began, and then would often borrow from earlier chronicles, adapt them, edit them to make a new narrative, and then would add what's happening in their own era. And this is what Michael the Great did. There's only one surviving manuscript of the chronicle in the original language, which is Syriac. And Syriac is the Christian form of the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, Aramaic. So Aramaic, the language of Jesus, the language of all sorts of cultures in that region, and Syriac developing as a written form of Aramaic used by the Christians of Mesopotamia. Now, Michael the Great lived in an interesting era because he was in the Near East as a Syriac Christian when the Crusaders arrived. And the arrival of the Crusaders was not necessarily good news for local Christians. So the Crusaders came to liberate the Holy Land from the infidels and had no idea there were actually already Christians there, and that the arrival of the Crusaders was not necessarily good news for the local Christians. And so here's an example. Here's the Chronicle of Michael the Great. Many parts of it are in 3 columns, as you see at the bottom of this page. And I have a little call out here of a Syriac note about the launch of the Crusades. And here's a translation of it. So marking the fact, and this is just one of the many crusades, of course, in the year 1189, the kings and the armies of the Franks. Now this is a term used for all European foreigners. Right? So this is a term you find used in African culture, you find it in Middle East culture, all because of the French. So you blame it on the French. But Frank is a generic term for anybody who comes from outside, and particularly European. So the kings and the armies of the Franks left home with great zeal, and they sent before them by sea vast crowds of people speaking many languages, and here's a red flag, who couldn't understand each other. So this chaotic mass of foreign armies shows up, battles ensue. Initially the Crusaders actually do fairly well. They get a little piece of land in the Holy Land. But the price paid by the locals is recorded on the reverse of that same leaf of the manuscript. In that same year, so a few years later, after the Crusaders have arrived and the battles have happened and so on, upon the order of Malik Adil, Lord of Edessa, Edessa is now in southeast Turkey. It was the historic cradle of Syriac Christianity. The sound of the bells was silenced in the churches of Edessa. In other words, they punished the indigenous Christian community because of the actions of their Christian co-religionists from outside invading the country. Does this sound familiar? Iraq, 2003, other such events in recent history. And they wrote it down. And so we can begin to get a sense of what that event was like for the people who lived through it. And these kind of eyewitness accounts, then committed to writing, are precious views of what they were thinking and feeling, experiencing, and we hope surviving. So why manuscripts? So as I said, a manuscript contains whatever people thought worth writing down. It can be a sacred text, it can be a travelogue, it can be a history, it can be a grammar, and as I said, often a way to find ways to slip in interesting recent events. This living tradition of manuscripts can be found in some parts of the world even today. This is a village called Gomitogo. It's in Mali. It's not far from Djenné, which is the kind of second historic center of Islam in Mali in West Africa. Sitting there in the front in blue is Babu Traoré, who is a great supporter and friend of HMML. And Babu's job in a partnership to digitize manuscripts in the vicinity of Djenné was to go to the villages, talk to people, and win their trust so that their manuscripts could be digitized as part of our project there. The guy in the sand-colored clothing is a scribe. He's the son of the imam. And the manuscripts in front of them are manuscripts written by 3 generations of scribes in his family. So there's the history of Gomitogo, preserved in the sacred texts that were copied, but also, as our catalogers have discovered, oftentimes these manuscripts, which are a Quran or a legal text or something like that, will record information about things like significant climate events, famines, diseases, plagues, which helps us reconstruct an understanding of sometimes these larger forces of nature which are noted along the way in the manuscripts. By the way, this is just the kind of thing I love doing, is going to places like Gomitogo and meeting these living bearers and having them say, my grandfather wrote that one, my father wrote that one, and that one's mine. So why HMML? So it's important to note that one of the key aspects of our work is the fact that we do not take the manuscripts away from the communities that created them and kept them safe for centuries. So we don't do what happened in the past when Europeans, be they crusaders or representatives of the kind of colonial movement in the 18th centuries and subsequently did, which is find cool stuff, pack it up, and take it back to Paris or London or Rome or Berlin or wherever. Nor are we a SWAT team. So we don't go in and do all the work and say thank you very much and then go home and keep the images and share them online and all of that. We're partners. We believe in capacity building. We believe in enabling people to become protectors of their own manuscript heritage. So it's the reverse of the old colonial or imperial model. And I had the pleasure of doing that recently. This is actually within the last month, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. So here is a suitcase in an office at HMML. It is the biggest and heaviest suitcase I have ever experienced in my life. It is 70 pounds of digital imaging equipment, lovingly, beautifully packed by Wayne Torborg, our Director of Digital Collections and Imaging. Yours truly carried that suitcase to Ethiopia. At times I thought, this is the last suitcase I'll ever be able to carry in my life. And we got it there, and we got it past Ethiopian customs, who were far more interested in my bird-watching binoculars than they were in any of this. That's a whole nother story, which I won't bore you with at this point. But we were there to train a team of people from Somalia and Hargeisa, which is Western Somalia, Northern Somalia, sometimes called Somaliland, and Ethiopians who were going to do a mission to go into the field in the Jema region of Ethiopia and the Harar region of Ethiopia to find small manuscript collections and digitize them. So they needed the equipment, they needed the training. So there they are confronting the suitcase. It's the last time I ever touched that thing. Opening it up, and with Walid Murad in the sort of puffer vest, our longtime field director for projects outside of Europe, they take the contents out of the suitcase, they set up a studio, Walid shows them how to do it, and next thing you know, they're doing the work themselves, which is exactly the point. We continue to support them, so if something's not working, they send a WhatsApp message to Walid, or we can do a Zoom if we have to. But they're now empowered and enabled to preserve their own heritage. So there they all are. They got their certificate. That's a big deal. And they are working, again, back in Hargeisa to organize the field work, and they'll be launching the field work next month. So it's pretty cool stuff. So far, we have done this work in more than 40 countries in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and even here in North America. Since 1965, this has preserved maybe 500,000 manuscripts. We periodically try to count, and it's not easy for all sorts of reasons. And that's tens of millions of handwritten pages. So this is a lot of manuscript material. But it's important to note that as cool as that field work is, and the equipment side, the tech side, going out to remote locations, and all that sort of thing, preservation is not enough. And why? Why is preserving the manuscripts and digital images not sufficient? Our goal is to move from the vulnerability of handwritten heritage, which can be stolen or burned, destroyed, lost, eaten by the silverfish, and so on, to permanence. And just taking a digital photograph is not permanence, as we all know. All those digital images we took back in the day when they were on little cards you put in a camera. When's the last time you looked at those? And can you find that little card that has all of your vacation photos? Your phone, okay, yeah, they're on your phone. Is that permanent? I don't think so. So the permanent aspect of things and the move from what has been hidden, and even hidden digitally, locked in a digital image, the move from that to access, to full access, is a key part of what we do. So let's talk about permanence for just a minute. Pictures are taken. They're saved on a hard drive, a little small hard drive. The hard drive comes to Himmel. Immediately, the hard drives are backed up on high-quality digital tape, and we pack them up and we send them off to a mountain in Utah. So there's a backup copy of every photograph taken in Ethiopia or wherever on digital tape inside a mountain outside of Salt Lake City in the same canyon as the place where the Mormons have their microfilm. So this is a commercial enterprise that does this kind of care. The tapes are regularly refreshed to make sure the data is still good. So I tell people that, come the apocalypse or Armageddon or the collapse of civilization or whatever, I'll be there outside our tunnel, and the Mormons will be outside their tunnel, and between us, we will preserve human history. They've got the genealogy covered, we've got the rest of it. So we have the archiving, we have the safety of the images inside the mountain, but then we have the crucial step of cataloging a manuscript. So here's an image from our microfilm days, and we are scanning more and more of our microfilm. It's interesting. You might know some Latin, so you could read this one. This one's from Austria. But it's the work of our catalogers to fully understand what is in the manuscript and then to describe it in a way that makes sense and also enables you to find it online. So here's our cataloging team. They're all here today. We brought our remote catalogers in from across the country. And you've had a chance to talk with many of them at the tables in the back of the room. So we had a staff retreat the past week, and there they all are. And you can also admire our nice chairs. I was involved in selecting those chairs, and I feel rather strongly about them. They're very comfortable. So what do these people produce? They produce cataloging descriptions like this, which are available on our website. And here's one from a Latin manuscript. So lots of detail, lots of external links, different ways that titles are referred to, reference to authoritative databases of names. And of course, we also do it in other languages. So here's an example of one of those West African manuscripts with the cataloging information presented in Arabic and in English, links out to the particular name of the author. So this requires not only knowledge of a language and familiarity with manuscripts, but it requires the mastery of a series of technical standards which enable a particular text to be located online. Because if you don't use the same form of a name, or at least a ballpark similar form of a name, you're never going to find what you're looking for. In this sense, the digital world is far less forgiving than a card catalog. So to further this work, not only by Himmel, but also by others interested in manuscript scholarship, our team has created something called the Himmel Authority File, which takes every name, people, places, works, and so on, that they come across, figures out what the best form of the name is, finds out what all the other forms of the name are, and puts them online for anybody to use freely. And this is what a record looks like. That's a lot of information. And the hope is that we can help others in their work of cataloging and of scholarship to get to where they need to go in a way that works in the digital environment. So we're going to have a little bit of history now and a little bit of sense of why this work is so important and why it cannot wait. Why can it not wait? You never know what might happen. And Nina's image of the storm chaser is not that I'm looking for storms, but there have been a lot of them since 2003 when I became executive director, and there were a lot in the decades before. And so I'll tell you a little bit about some of those storms. So I've mentioned Ethiopia in terms of a recent project, but we also had a tremendously important, I would say groundbreaking, microfilming partnership with entities in Ethiopia in the 1970s and 1980s. It photographed over 8,000 Ethiopian manuscripts, and I would say kind of refounded the study of Ethiopic literature in the ancient language of Ge'ez, and also in the more modern Ethiopian language of Amharic, but particularly Ge'ez. Ethiopian Christian tradition is very important for the history of Christianity because it preserves a lot of texts and practices which later went out of favor in the Greek and Latin churches. So there are whole books of the Bible which were written by Jews in Greek, which later were rejected by Jews because they were in Greek rather than Hebrew, and then by Christians who thought they were just a little weird. But in fact, when you read them, you get tremendous insight into what was happening in the religious milieu of the ancient Near East around the time of Jesus. So here's an example of one of those manuscripts. Microfilmed in Ethiopia in 1979. It contained some of those unusual books that you won't find in a Western Bible, whether Hebrew or Latin Greek. That manuscript is now in Oslo, Norway. I know you can't really read it, but if you were to read the fine print of the shot with the color image of the manuscript, it reveals the provenance of the manuscript is the name of a dealer in London. This was not legally taken out of the country. It's an example of the sort of thing that happens in conflict zones, places of acute poverty and deprivation, which are exploited by foreigners who come and offer somebody $20 for a really cool manuscript and then take it home and sell it for thousands of pounds, as was the case of this one in London. It was filmed at Gar Selassie Monastery in Ethiopia, and now it's in Scandinavia. Now, in some cases, when you have a situation like this, you can facilitate the return of the manuscript, but not when it's something that has such tremendous commercial value. And how did it leave Ethiopia? Well, anybody remember this fellow in the middle? Emperor Haile Selassie. And to his left is Dr. Julian Plant, who was a previous director of HMML. And to his right is Dr. Walter Harrelson, who was a scholar of the Bible at Vanderbilt Divinity School. The two of them, the two Americans, were the ones who got the idea to go do this work in Ethiopia, partnered with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and the Ethiopian National Library to microfilm all of those manuscripts. Not long after this photograph was taken, the emperor was killed in a revolution, a violent revolution in Ethiopia, which then installed a dictatorship. And the roots of that, or the roots of the present crisis in Ethiopia, are because that the reign of that dictatorship was ended by a group of rebels from the northern part of Ethiopia in the Tigray province. They then took over the government for many years, and the current conflict is resentment of the ascendancy of that particular ethnic group in Ethiopia over the ones who feel they should be the rightful rulers. So in other words, tremendous chaos ensued, and that's how those manuscripts began to disappear. Easier for somebody just to grab, or for somebody to sell, or who knows how they got out of the country. But that's what happens when you have tremendous instability. And sadly, sad to say, Ethiopia today is just as conflict-ridden as it was years ago. I was in Addis less than a month ago. You can't go more than 25 or 30 kilometers outside of the city. And you certainly can't go to the north, to Tigray, where some of us have had HMML adventures before on HMML trips to Ethiopia, because it's a war zone today, right now. So you never know what might happen. But it's also the case that things can happen in very unexpected places. Some of you who are in the kind of library and museum world may remember that the archive, the state archive in the city of Cologne, Germany, which is a classic sort of 1970s, German-style functional building, collapsed suddenly in 2009 when they were digging a subway tunnel alongside its foundation. And somebody either hadn't done the right study of what the situation was, or who knows what happened. But that's the history of Cologne, including hundreds of medieval manuscripts reduced to that pile of rubble. Now, the good news is Himmel had microfilmed the manuscripts. So at least there are microfilms of the manuscripts. And since 2009, they've worked at recovering what they could. So apparently many of the manuscripts were not as badly damaged as you would think, but some, of course, were. And all these other sorts of records and things are virtually unrecoverable. Paper documents, photographs, this kind of thing. Because how does it survive a dramatic collapse like this? And then there is the case of Syria. So earlier I showed you the picture of that safe, opening it up, taking that manuscript out, Michael the Great, the only surviving copy in Syriac. This is the fellow who unlocked the safe, Mar Gregorios Johanna Ibrahim. So we had that view of the manuscript somewhere around, must have been like 2007 or 8, I think, is when we took it out of the vault, and we shortly thereafter digitized it. Syrian civil war breaks out in 2011. I was actually in Damascus about a week before, and something felt off. And then the war starts. In 2013, it reaches Aleppo and parts of northern Syria. Mar Gregorios and his Greek Orthodox counterpart, Metropolitan Paul Yazigi, Boulos Yazigi, were kidnapped as they drove to the Turkish border to have a church gathering on the other side of the border, and never heard from again. So this is a man who led a community. He had the vision to understand the importance of digitizing all of the manuscripts under their control, including that unique chronicle of Michael the Great, and then was a collateral damage in a war. And it was probably simply a kidnapping gone bad, and the people didn't really know what to do. Now we got him, how do we get a ransom, et cetera, et cetera. But the upshot is, he gave his life. And then there's Iraq. We started working in Iraq in 2009. So this is the aftermath of the American-led invasion of Iraq, the downfall of Saddam Hussein. And in 2009, things were just starting to kind of calm down. In fact, my first trip to Iraq in 2009, which began on Ash Wednesday. So when people say, what are you doing for Lent? And I say, oh, I'm going to Iraq. So we crossed the border. We're in a village, Christian village. And as we enter the Christian village, our local Iraqi priest, you'll hear more about, said, by the way, they don't like Americans here. So I'm going to tell them you're French, because French was our common language. And so there I am, French, in this village. And on television is President Obama announcing the American withdrawal from Iraq. So it's like the one time it would be good to be an American, and they might even be nice to you. I'm Inspector Clouseau. So we started this partnership in 2009. We continued to work with colleagues in Iraq, particularly the great now Archbishop Najib Mikhail, a hero of historic preservation, who had begun a digital project to preserve manuscripts right around the year 2000. He was based in that village of Karakosh, the one where I was briefly French, and I think Karen Erickson is in the room. I think I told you that I wrote a love letter to my high school French teacher as a result of that, just thanking her for starting my journey into that language, which has come to be extremely useful in a lot of places, not just for survival. 2009, all right, so 2014, June, the conquest of Mosul, the rise of what we call ISIS, they call Daesh. It seemed to come from nowhere, as so many of these movements seem to do. So they take over Mosul. This is a tremendous shock because very important banking and commercial center in Iraq. And then they start to move east, heading toward Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan and the center of the petroleum industry in the northern part of the country. And as they go, they devastate culture. They blow up the ancient monument of Nimrud with barrel bombs and bulldozers, so these great Assyrian sculptures. They blow up Christian shrines, like the shrine of Mar Banam. Refugees flee the villages, Yazidis, Christians, in the August heat of Iraq, moving from these ancient villages inhabited for millennia to the city of Erbil, many of them walking 40 miles through the heat of the Iraqi summer. And of course, there was great cultural loss. This is an example of a manuscript that was in Mosul. And it was digitized, and if you look at the bottom of the right-hand side of the slide, you can see it was digitized in 2012. 2014 is when the rise of ISIS occurred, and most of the manuscripts of these communities in Mosul were lost. Destroyed, burned, stolen, a handful have resurfaced. So here's a 13th century Syriac manuscript. Current status unknown, and frankly presumed lost. Another example, Ukraine. We worked in Ukraine from 2007 until actually quite recently in the western city of Lviv and surrounding towns. At the time of the Russian invasion in 2022, the museum, the principal museum of Lviv, took their art, bundled it up, and hid it in safe locations. And there you can see them taking a magnificent icon panel. The manuscripts, however, of that same museum have now been completely digitized, many of them actually during the war, so that whatever happens there, at least there's a copy outside. And the particular manuscript here is a late 15th, early 16th century Slavonic Bible. And that's the opening leaf with a kind of introduction to the Bible to explain what you do with it in the liturgy. Current status is hidden. Mali. So we heard about Mali a little bit earlier, about manuscripts being evacuated from places like Timbuktu. So we started working in Mali in 2013, I think was my first visit, working with those very manuscripts that were evacuated. So 1,400 metal boxes full of manuscripts from that great historic desert center of Islamic learning, taken to the capital of Bamako, completely different climate, conservation, disaster, and they've now all been digitized. And tens and tens and tens of thousands of those manuscripts are now online, thanks to Ali and Paul sitting over there, are indefatigable catalogers of West African manuscripts. But we knew that there were manuscripts up in Timbuktu because the Malian people were used to foreign invaders and to internal difficulties. The Moroccans, the French, whoever the heck these people were who came out of the desert and threatened Timbuktu and occupied it for a year. So we wanted to get up there. So we did. We finally got to Timbuktu. There's some stories, but they're for another time. But the point is to go into the town to meet with the leaders we needed to meet in order to negotiate projects and build relationships and get the cameras going with local teams. We often had to travel like this, UN escorts. Because although Timbuktu had been technically liberated, it remained vulnerable. And in fact, for the last couple of years, has been under a total blockade. Nobody going in, nobody going out. And the future of its manuscript collections, uncertain. So here's an example of one of those manuscripts. Current status, we don't know what's happened to it. I assume it's safe, but we don't know what's going to happen in terms of the blockade of the city. And as we speak, Mali is imploding. So the country itself is ceasing to function. And when that kind of thing happens, cultural heritage is at tremendous risk for those who don't appreciate it or who are ideologically opposed to it. And then Gaza. We partnered with the British Library to help the scholars associated with the Great Omari Mosque in Gaza City to digitize their manuscript collection. Great project, great local team. We did it through our field director in Jerusalem. It's a very interesting structure built on top of a Byzantine church, which is probably built on top of some kind of pre-Christian temple. And of course, it suffered terribly in the war. So that's the Great Omari Mosque, as you would see it today, if you could get to Gaza City, which of course you can't. But the good news is, every single one of their manuscripts have been digitized before the conflict that broke out in 2023. And they're safely available online. Status of this one, we have no idea where it is. No idea whatsoever. And you know, people, it's not getting any better out there, which means there is an urgency to the work that we do, which has become more and more pressing in the years since 2003. So, finally, looking back and looking forward, the original inspiration for Himmel was deeply rooted in Benedictine monasticism and Benedictine history. Does anybody know who this figure is? Matt does. Okay, Matt, you don't count. Tom Barrett. Jean Mabillon, excellent, and probably because you've heard me talk about him before, and you know this kind of thing, Tom. Jean Mabillon was a French Benedictine scholar at the monastery of Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris, and many of you know that church. The church is still there, and in fact, there's a memorial to him in that church, which I visit anytime I'm in Paris. Jean Mabillon lived at a time when printed books were in the ascendant. So he's not a medieval monk. He's an early modern monk. And he said, you know, we better go out and round up all the manuscripts we can because people are just throwing them out because they're getting printed books. And so he and his confrères at Saint-Germain-des-Prés undertook what they called literary voyages. So a voyage littéraire. They go to Italy, they go to Spain, they go all over the place, riding a donkey and either acquiring manuscripts or having them copied. And on the basis of those manuscripts, they produced magnificent folio editions of classical and early Christian texts. It was that spirit that led our founder, Father Oliver Kapsner, carrying that big pile of large format medieval manuscripts, to look at Cold War Europe and say, what are we going to do in case there's nuclear conflict, World War III, what about all the manuscripts? So it's like Jean Mabillon, for different reasons, but the same impulse. So Oliver indefatigably went around all the monastic libraries of Austria, where monasteries had kept their manuscripts. Reformation hadn't taken them away, revolutions, Napoleon hadn't taken them away, and the project began with microfilming in those magnificent Austrian libraries. That same impulse has taken us to places like the Abba Garima Monastery in northern Ethiopia, where we were able to digitize the oldest known Ethiopic manuscripts. It's taken us to Timbuktu, as I mentioned, where I had the pleasure of meeting the Grand Imam of Timbuktu. Now, who would have thought that a project that began microfilming in Austria would end up in northern Ethiopia, in Mali? And there's the whole South Asian chapter of our work that I haven't touched on today because it's underway right now with more than a dozen studios operating in both India and Pakistan. So, as we look at this history, and we realize where we've been, and we think about where we might go, sometimes you're confronted with a choice. And this is my favorite traffic sign in the world. I have a collection of photos of interesting signs. This is in Ukraine, Lviv, Ukraine. Okay, you're driving down the street. You can't go left. You can't go right. And then in this particular street, you couldn't go straight ahead either. And so you would think they would have told you back there that, you know, it is a kind of dead-end situation. But in the case of Himmel, if you can't go left and you can't go right, where do you go? You keep going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Columba, for such a wonderful presentation that looked at Himmel's history, but also looked forward for how we can continue our work around the world. We have a few minutes for questions, and we have two lovely assistants who have microphones. If you do have a question, please raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you so the live stream can hear what you're asking. Open it up. Any questions? Yes, please.
Could you talk about Ukraine? Is Himmel involved in that country?
In Ukraine, yes. So we did several projects in Western Ukraine, and the largest were in Lviv, Lvov, Lemberg, depending on what era of their history. They went by various names. And the most important was the state library, the Vasily Stefanik National Library, and the other was this National Museum, where you saw the art being taken down in the image. Their collection, which was the personal collection of a great Ukrainian Catholic leader, Archbishop Andrei Sheptytsky. Now, because it's Ukraine, these are all state institutions, because in the Soviet era, the state took all of the manuscripts and put them in central repositories, but that's where we worked there.
I remember a cathedral on the river in Kiev, and we went down, and there were coffins and all that, but wouldn't it have lots of manuscripts?
So they would have all been taken in the Soviet era and put in the Vernadsky National Library is the one in Kyiv. So the churches are flourishing in Ukraine now, but without their manuscripts, because those are all in state libraries. And this is typical of all of the former Soviet and sort of Eastern Bloc countries.
Hi, Columba. It looks from the pictures that you showed us that you are a predictor of national and international crises that are going to decimate all the manuscript collections. But really, how do you decide? I mean, is it a total accident that we've done things in Gaza and then a few years later Gaza is attacked? Is it how do you know where there's a
no
war going to
causal
break
link.
out, or is it just an accident? I mean, I'm just curious. That's what it seems like, is that you have some sort of second sight about world conflicts. I suspect that's not true, but how do you sort of decide, well, which part of the world does Himmel go to work in next?
So there is an organic development of our projects. So we started in Austria with monastic libraries, then it was other religious orders, then the Austrian National Library, then other countries in Europe. So there's an obvious connection because you're working within a particular manuscript culture. So you're working within the Latin manuscript heritage of Western Europe. Ethiopia was just this brainchild of Professor Harrelson and Dr. Julian Plant. And then that turned into a thing important in its own right. And that was the first foray of Himmel into Eastern Christian manuscript preservation. And then that continued starting in 2003 in the digital era with the work in the Middle East, and that's when I started. So let's work with all the different historic Christian cultures in this region. We started in Lebanon led to Syria, that led to Turkey, that led to Iraq. So it becomes a pretty comprehensive project to preserve a larger manuscript culture within a particular region or linguistic tradition. The turn to Islamic manuscripts was organic and also serendipitous. This happened actually in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is a very interesting place. Sidebar, every known Hebrew manuscript in the world has already been photographed by a project now at the National Library of Israel. So that's fantastic. That's a unique situation. However, Christian and Islamic manuscripts in that part of the world are things that we would be interested in doing. So we were doing some work in Jerusalem at a Syriac Orthodox monastery, and our field director there is a Palestinian Greek Orthodox Christian, was very good friends with the son of a major historic Muslim family in the Old City. They're like 4 or 5 ancient Muslim families who have been there since the Islamic conquest. And he said, what about our manuscripts? So we talked to the board, and is this something we do? We've always done Christian stuff. We don't have to do Hebrew stuff. We don't do Buddhist, etc. And my argument to them was, these communities are about 100 yards from each other. This one library of Syriac, this family library of Islamic material. They've lived together for centuries. They've talked politics, they've argued theology, they've gone to each other's funerals and weddings, they've done business. Why would you not preserve their culture so that you get the full 360 view of the intellectual life and historic life of that most fascinating and most complex location in the world? That then led to Mali, because there had been this crisis in Mali, there was a lot of anxiety about manuscripts. It made sense then for us to get involved because we'd already made a turn in the direction of Islamic manuscripts in the work in Jerusalem. That then took us back to South Asia, where we had done work in India with Christian manuscripts, and now we're working with Islamic tradition manuscripts in South Asia. So it all coheres, and sometimes it's like building a jigsaw puzzle from the piece out, and sometimes it's like you figure out what a corner is, and so you put it up there, and you work in, but the result is the full picture. And that's the ultimate goal. And no, Lyndall, I don't have a sixth sense for when things are going to happen, but you know, that's our world right now. And in fact, that's always been our world. We were just fooled by decades of peace.
Columba, I'm disappointed in your speech. I've heard you speak before and show us a picture of children learning to read from a 14th century manuscript in Ethiopia, a manuscript written in Ge'ez. I will never forget that image. Incredible. So I have to remind you of that. Don't ever forget that image. But now I can ask you a real question after telling you that I'm really pretty excited by what you've written and said today. What about Afghanistan? What about Afghanistan?
Okay, so we actually had a conversation going with the National Archives of Afghanistan in Kabul before the Taliban reemerged and took it over again. And the problem in countries like Afghanistan, and what's the country like? That's a meaningless statement. But the problem in some countries with unstable governments, let's put it this way, is there's a different minister of culture every week because these are political appointees. So you get a good one, you negotiate, it's great, that person gets canned, they put a new one in who's clueless, doesn't get it, and the project's off. So we were back and forth with them right up to the time of the reemergence of the Taliban and then the evacuation, of course, of American forces and others. There had been some tentative contacts since then. I've been told it's okay to go to Kabul, but I have to admit, Nina, even with my appetite for adventure, I don't think I'm quite there yet. But Afghanistan does have a superb collection of Persian manuscripts in their National Archive, and that would be the thing to do. So it's not off the burner, and it connects 100% with what we're doing in Pakistan and in India, because it's the same culture, the same literary culture. But at least for the moment, no. I think we need to get to food.
Yes, indeed. So can we please thank Dr. Columba Stewart one more time for a wonderful presentation. I want to formally invite you all to the reception, which is just right outside in the Commons. Continue the conversation. If you have any questions about Himmel, find someone with a name tag. They're associated with Himmel and would be happy to direct you to the right person that would answer the question that you have. So once again, thank you for joining us. It really does take a community to help preserve and share the world's handwritten past. And so you all make that happen. Thank you so much, and please join us for coffee and refreshments right outside.